Hi, everybody. This is Mark Newman, founder of Precision Analytical, the makers of the Dutch test. And I want to explain to you in this video some of the new elements that we have in our new report format. This report format features a new summary page that is meant to help you extract the most relevant information from a Dutch test efficiently. See some of the other videos for an overview of this new main feature, but we also have a few additional features that we want to go through in this video to make sure that you understand these new features and how to leverage them in your interpretation. Recently, we released a new version of our androgen dials that you've probably already experienced, but I wanted to just show those briefly in case it's been a while since you've done a Dutch test. You can see here that we have the overall range, say for testosterone, of 2.3 to 14.0, but now we also have embedded in that the postmenopausal norm of 2.3 to 6.3, the purple band, and the luteal norm, or the young, healthy female range, of 4 to 14. So you can see those age-dependent ranges wrapped right into the dial. Now, that is not a brand new element, but we do have a few elements with the new release of this report that I want to go over briefly because these are going to really help with your interpretation. So for the cortisol curves, remember the Dutch Plus, we have the salivary curve, and you can see here that we've brought the data from the CAR, the cortisol awakening response, forward onto this. These data used to be in paragraphical form on page 5 of the report, and now right on the summary page, you can see the elevation in the cortisol awakening response, and that's put here conveniently for you so you don't have to dig into other pages to find that. It's right there on the front page. Additionally, we are listing the time collections for these samples right under the data points themselves. I think this will help, especially with patients who maybe have an abnormal collection time. And then additionally, you can see on the right something that didn't used to be on the curve itself, which is the mid-sleep sample. So we used to call this the insomnia sample. This is the sample that at 2 a.m., when you can't sleep, you're collecting to see if cortisol is part of your sleep story. We're going to put that on our diurnal curve. Additionally, if people decide to collect that sample at noon in the midday, we're also going to put that on the curve. So again, these used to be listed on the tables. Now we're going to be plotting them conveniently on this diurnal curve so that you can see all of the data. On the urine curve for a Dutch complete, this is a change that a lot of people requested, and we definitely heard your feedback. And that is when a patient wakes in the middle of the night and collects that extra mid-sleep sample, we weren't plotting that as an extra data point. You can see here on the left that when the wake up time at 2 a.m. comes and then they go back to sleep and wake up at 6 a.m., now instead of a 4-point curve, you're getting a 5-point curve so that you can assess whether that value happens to be a little bit high in both the mid-sleep sample and the waking sample. And then as we have in saliva, we're listing the time points here on the x-axis so you can see exactly when those collections were very conveniently listed right by the data. On this page, which has the metabolic breakdown for the sex hormones, we have a few new elements. The total DHEA production is the adding up of 3 primary metabolites. This used to be only featured on the front page, so you'd have to flip back and forth between this sum and its individual component parts that make it up: DHEAS, etiocalanolone, and androsterone. Now we've listed it conveniently here on this page. We've also added a 5-alpha slider for progesterone. This is particularly important when people are on oral progesterone and you want to know how much of those alpha metabolites like allopregnanolone are they making, and you can see that here. Now, we also have one element that is actually going away, and that is something we're probably going to get some questions on because we know some of you really love to interpret the estrogen metabolism with this pie chart. But there's a better way to do that, and so we want to be progressing with the science. So I want to show you some data that helps to explain why we want to move from the pie chart to the 2 separate sliders. When you have a situation where the 16-hydroxy is particularly big, or in this case, particularly small, it becomes harder to get accurate information on the relationship between the 2-hydroxy and the 4-hydroxy estrogens. Let me explain the science of that a little bit, because the issue between the 2 and the 16 is one of estrogenic. And the issue between the 2 and the 4 is more of a genotoxic issue, meaning the 4-hydroxy can damage DNA and the 2-hydroxy is going to compete with it. So the 4-hydroxy you can see here on the left creates this reactive quinone you can see in the middle. And then what does it do? It's actually able to break a piece of DNA off. So that is the estrogen metabolite and a piece of DNA. It has that reactive potential, and the 2 is protective to that. That's a genotoxic issue. The 16-hydroxy works more at the receptor level, meaning you're getting estrogenic impact less so than the genotoxic issue that we see with the 4-hydroxy, meaning it's a secondary issue that's different than we see with the 4. So we care about the 2 competing with the 4, and we care about the 2 competing with the 16, but it's a more accurate representation of this to look at it as 2 separate issues. I included a study here. If you want to pause the video and read that, that might clear up some of that issue in terms of why the receptor level impact of the 16 and the 2 are so important. But let me show you a case where it really highlights the importance of my point. In this case, the 16-hydroxy is really big. At 9.1, we can see there's a lot of that. So the 16 is dominating the 2. We can also see that as an estrogenic issue on the slider on the left. So the pie chart and the slider tell a very similar story in terms of what's going on. But when we look at the 4-hydroxy, the range is 7.5 to 11% on the pie chart. But because the 16-hydroxy is so big, it's actually below range, which kind of gives you the message that there's very, very little of the 4-hydroxy. But remember, the 4-hydroxy is competing only against the 2-hydroxy, and that is this genotoxic issue. And we can see from the slider that when you only compare those 2 metabolites, the 4-hydroxy is actually winning out in that comparison between the 2-hydroxy and the 4-hydroxy. So using the pie chart can be misleading in a significant number of cases. And we don't want you to miss cases like this. We want you to characterize these patients properly as it relates to their phase 1 metabolism. The sliders are a better way to do that. So we're going to be retiring the pie chart and just using those sliders when we're telling the phase 1 estrogen metabolism story. Additionally, we've noted that the shading on this page makes it a little bit difficult to see some of the colors on the dials. So we're going to be taking the color away from that page just to make it a little bit easier to print and a little bit easier to understand the results within that page. Also, we know that now that the phase 1 sliders and the methylation, that information from this page is brought forward to the summary page. So you're going to want to flip back and forth to tell this story related to page 1. So we're going to put this page second and make it page 2 so that you can really tell that story well, which makes the table page of these metabolites that used to be page 2 now following on page 3, and then the adrenal page to follow with page 4. So we're confident that these new elements and this new layout for the summary page will really help you leverage the most information and be efficient in telling this hormone story to your patients. Please do see our other videos on this new introductory page layout and some of the more advanced concepts that you'll find in some of the other videos. And we look forward to working with you and your patients.